Imagine descending 78 feet below the streets of Manhattan. The year is 1905. The air around you thickens with every step down the narrow shaft. You're not climbing into an elevator. You're entering a pressurized chamber where the air itself could kill you. The pressure squeezes your chest, makes your ears scream, sends shooting pains through your skull. You'll work a 10-hour shift in this suffocating darkness, drilling through bedrock and mud beneath the East River. And when you emerge, if you emerge, there's a 1 in 3 chance you'll collapse with a mysterious affliction called the bends. Your body will twist in agony. Blood will pour from your nose and ears. Some men die on the spot. Others are paralyzed for life. Yet every morning, thousands of immigrant workers known as sandhogs descend into these underwater death traps for 2 a day. They had no choice. Their families were starving. And America needed its tunnels. What drove these men to risk being buried alive beneath New York City? To understand, you have to see what really happened in the darkness beneath our feet. The story begins not in the 20th century, but decades earlier, when New York City stood at a crossroads. By 1870, Manhattan had become a suffocating island choked by its own success. Street-level traffic, horse-drawn carriages, streetcars, pedestrians, clogged every avenue. The city's population had exploded to over 940,000 people, and the elevated railways that snaked above the streets could no longer handle the crush. Entrepreneurs and engineers looked downward. If London could build underground railways, why not New York? But beneath the glamorous vision lay a brutal reality. Someone would have to dig those tunnels. Someone would have to descend into the earth and claw through rock, mud, and water. Someone would have to risk everything. Alfred Ely Beach, the visionary publisher and inventor, built the first demonstration of an underground transit system in 1869. His beach pneumatic transit was a marvel. A 312-foot tunnel beneath Broadway powered by a giant fan that pushed a single car through the tube like a bullet through a barrel. Over 400,000 riders experienced his pneumatic subway during its first year of operation, paying 25 cents to glide through the tunnel in cushioned luxury. But Beach faced insurmountable political obstacles. Boss Tweed, the corrupt political machine that controlled New York, blocked every expansion plan. By 1873, a stock market crash had destroyed Beach's financial backing. The tunnel entrance was sealed. The project died. Yet the seed had been planted. New York would go underground. It was only a question of when and at what cost. That cost would be measured not in dollars, but in human lives. On March 24, 1900, a ceremony at City Hall celebrated the groundbreaking of the city's first official subway line. The contract had been awarded to John B. McDonald, a construction magnate funded by August Belmont, a banking titan with deep pockets. The plan was audacious. 9.1 miles of underground tunnel running from City Hall North to 145th Street, cutting through some of the hardest bedrock and softest riverbed in America. The method they chose was called cut and cover, literally tearing up entire streets, digging trenches 30 to 60 feet deep, building steel and concrete tunnels, then covering them back up. It was brutal, dangerous work. And it required an army of laborers willing to do what no one else would. Enter the Sandhogs. The name itself conjures images of men rooting through dirt like animals. And in many ways, that's exactly what they did. Most were recent immigrants, Irish, Italian, German, Polish, men who had fled poverty and famine in Europe only to find themselves at the bottom of America's economic ladder. They lived in crowded tenements in the Five Points, Hell's Kitchen, and the Lower East Side. They sent every spare penny back to families in the old country. They took the most dangerous jobs because no one else would. And in 1900, there was no job more dangerous than digging New York's subway. The work began with the cut and cover sections, tearing up Broadway, Lafayette Street, Park Avenue. Crews of 50 to 100 men would descend into these open trenches, swinging pickaxes, shoveling dirt, hauling wheelbarrows of rock. They had to navigate a nightmare of underground obstacles. Sewer lines laid in the 1850s, water mains 3 feet in diameter, gas pipes that could explode without warning, electrical conduits carrying enough voltage to kill a man instantly. 12 miles of sewers had to be rerouted. Foundations of buildings towering 5 and 6 stories above had to be underpinned. Massive steel beams driven beneath existing structures to prevent collapse. Street railways had to be torn up. And all of this had to happen while the city continued to function above their heads. But the real horror came when the work went underwater. To cross the Harlem River and later the East River, engineers employed a technology called pneumatic caissons. Massive iron chambers sunk to the riverbed and pressurized with compressed air to keep water from flooding in. Workers would enter through airlocks, descend into these pressurized chambers, and dig through the river bottom in near total darkness. The method was not new. It had been used in the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge in the 1870s, and had killed dozens of men. But in 1900 no one fully understood why. The science was simple, but the consequences were deadly. When you pressurize air to 35, 40, or even 45 pounds per square inch, 2 to 3 times normal atmospheric pressure, nitrogen dissolves into your bloodstream. Stay down there long enough, and your blood becomes saturated with it. Come up too quickly, and that nitrogen forms bubbles, tiny explosions in your veins, your joints, your brain. This was caisson disease, also called the bends, because men doubled over in agony as they emerged from the pressurized chambers. Some went blind. Others were paralyzed. Many died within hours, blood pouring from every orifice as their bodies literally tore apart from the inside. Caisson disease historical medical illustration, showing effects of caisson disease on workers on January 9, 1908, the Joralemon Street Tunnel opened, connecting Manhattan to Brooklyn beneath the East River. It was a triumph of engineering, the first underwater subway tunnel in New York City. But its construction had exacted a terrible price. Hospital records from the period show dozens of sandhogs admitted with symptoms of decompression sickness. Dr. Andrew Smith, who studied the workers on the Brooklyn Bridge project, documented cases in excruciating detail. Men whose joints swelled to twice their normal size, men who lost consciousness and never woke up, men who begged to die rather than endure another minute of pain. Yet there was no compensation, no workers' compensation laws, no safety regulations. If a man died, his family got nothing. Another immigrant would take his place the next day. The human toll extended beyond caisson disease. Tunnel collapses were common. On March 15, 1902, a section of tunnel near Bleecker Street caved in, burying 5 workers alive. Rescuers dug for 6 hours before reaching the bodies, all dead from suffocation. Dynamite blasts used to break through solid rock claimed lives regularly. Michael Carney, an Irish immigrant working near Grand Central Station, was killed instantly when a premature explosion tore through his work crew on August 3, 1903. His body was so mangled it had to be identified by the brass tag he wore around his neck, number 347. Gas leaks from broken mains asphyxiated workers without warning, and fires sparked by exposed electrical wires or open flames used for light turned tunnels into death traps where men had no way to escape. But perhaps the most insidious killer was the dust. In sections where hard Manhattan schist, a metamorphic rock that forms the island's geological foundation, had to be drilled and blasted, the air filled with silica particles so fine they hung suspended for hours. The men breathed this dust with every breath. It coated their lungs, scarred their tissue, caused a disease called silicosis that slowly strangled them over years. By the time a sandhog reached 40, his lungs were often so damaged he could barely walk a city block. They called it miner's consumption, and it killed more men than any single accident ever could. The men who did this work were not heroes in their own time. They were expendable labor. Contractors calculated human loss as part of the cost of doing business. A common saying among subway engineers was a man a mile. The grim expectation that for every mile of tunnel dug, at least one worker would die. The 7,700 workers who built the original IRT subway lines between 1900 and 1904 faced these odds every single day. They started work at dawn, descended into the trenches or tunnels, and worked until dusk 10, sometimes 12 hours of backbreaking labor. Their pay? $2 to $2.50 a day for common laborers. For skilled men like carpenters and masons, it was barely enough to survive. Yet they kept coming. Why? Because the alternative was worse. In the tenements of the Lower East Side, entire families lived in single rooms without windows, without running water, without heat. Children died of tuberculosis and diphtheria. Starvation was a real threat. For a man with a family to feed, a job with the subway Dangerous as it was, represented hope. It was steady work. It was paid in cash every Saturday. And if he survived long enough, he might save enough to bring his wife and children over from Ireland or Italy. So he took the risk. Every morning, he kissed his wife goodbye, not knowing if he'd return that evening. And every evening she waited, listening for his footsteps on the stairs, praying he wouldn't be carried home on a stretcher. Some men found small moments of pride in the work. James O'Rourke, an Irish sandhog who worked on the first IRT line, later recalled the camaraderie of the crews. "We looked out for each other down there," he told a newspaper reporter in 1925. "If a man got in trouble, you went after him. Didn't matter if it was a cave-in, a gas leak, or just a man frozen with fear. You brought him out." That code of solidarity, forged in the darkness beneath the city, became the foundation of the sandhog identity, a tradition passed down through generations, fathers teaching sons, brothers bringing in cousins, entire families spending decades underground. On October 27, 1904, the first subway line officially opened to the public. Over 150,000 New Yorkers paid 5 cents to ride the new trains on opening day alone. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle of modern engineering. Mayor George B. McClellan Jr. personally drove the first train from City Hall to 145th Street, grinning for photographers as crowds cheered. But in the press coverage, in the speeches, in the celebrations, there was barely a mention of the men who had made it possible. The sandhogs were invisible. Their deaths were footnotes. Their suffering was the price of progress. But the work was far from finished. The first line was just the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, New York would excavate hundreds of miles of additional tunnels. The Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, BRT, began its own subway projects, using the same dangerous methods. The Independent Subway System, IND, launched in the 1920s, dug even deeper, reaching depths of 180 feet below street level. Each project demanded more workers, more lives, more sacrifice. And the carnage continued. Between 1900 and 1940, historians estimate that at least 100 sandhogs died in subway construction accidents, though the true number is likely much higher, as many deaths went unreported or were attributed to natural causes to avoid legal liability. Consider the construction of the Pennsylvania Station tunnels, built between 1903 and 1910, to connect Manhattan to New Jersey beneath the Hudson River. This project employed pneumatic caissons at depths reaching 75 feet below the riverbed, deeper than any previous tunnel in America. The pressure inside these caissons reached 47 pounds per square inch. Workers could only stay down for 4-hour shifts before the nitrogen saturation became lethal. Even with these precautions, dozens of men were crippled. Richard Creedon, a sandhog from County Cork, Ireland, emerged from a shift in 1908 and collapsed on the dock. Within minutes he was unconscious. He died 3 days later in Bellevue Hospital, his body twisted into a fetal position from the agony of the bends. He was 28 years old. His wife, pregnant with their 3rd child, received no death benefits, no compensation. She was evicted from her tenement 2 months later. The economic calculations behind these projects were cold and ruthless. In 1905, the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, IRT, spent approximately $35 million on construction of the first subway, about $1.1 billion in today's dollars. Of that sum, labor costs accounted for less than 20%. A human life, in the ledgers of the companies, was worth perhaps $500 in lost productivity and replacement costs. Insurance companies offered policies to contractors covering workplace deaths. Premiums were calculated based on the expected fatality rate. For subway work, the premiums were high. The actuaries knew what they were doing. Yet the subway system grew. By 1920, New York had over 300 miles of track, 277 stations, and carried more than 1.3 billion passengers a year. It was the largest rapid transit system in the world, and it had been built, mile by bloody mile, by men whose names are lost to history. Walk through any subway station today, Times Square, Grand Central, Union Square, and you're walking through spaces carved out by men who risked everything for wages that barely kept their families alive. The tiles on the walls, the vaulted ceilings, the platforms where millions of commuters stand every day. All of it exists because sandhogs were willing to descend into the darkness. The dangers didn't end with the construction of the subway. Even after the initial lines were complete, the work continued. Water tunnels had to be dug to supply the growing city. The first New York City water tunnel, completed in 1917, required years of labor deep beneath the Bronx and Queens. Water Tunnel Number 3, begun in 1970 and still under construction today, has claimed the lives of 24 workers over more than 5 decades. The most recent death occurred in 2022, when a sandhog was killed in a tunnel collapse 600 feet below street level. The tradition of sacrifice continues. Modern safety regulations have reduced the death toll, but the work remains brutal. Today's sandhogs, members of Local 147 of the Laborers International Union, use tunnel boring machines instead of pickaxes, and they have access to medical care and workers' compensation. But they still descend into spaces where a single mistake can be fatal. They still work in compressed air environments where decompression sickness is a constant threat. They still drill through rock that produces lung-scarring dust. And they still pass the tradition down through families, grandfather to son, generation after generation, building the infrastructure that keeps New York alive. What do we owe these men? What do we owe the sandhogs who built our subways, our tunnels, our water mains? In 2000, New York City dedicated a memorial in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx to honor the 24 workers who died building Water Tunnel Number 3. It's a small granite monument, easy to miss. Most New Yorkers don't know it exists. And that perhaps is the larger tragedy, that the men who risked everything to build this city remain invisible, their stories untold, their sacrifices forgotten. Today, as New York plans new subway extensions and infrastructure projects, we face a choice. We can continue to treat construction workers as expendable, as mere costs in a budget. Or we can recognize that every tunnel, every bridge, every building in this city was built by human hands, by men and women who deserve more than our indifference. The sandhogs of the early 1900s didn't have a choice. They worked or they starved. But we have a choice. We can choose to remember. We can choose to honor their sacrifice. And we can choose to ensure that no worker in the 21st century faces the same brutal conditions that killed so many a century ago. The New York City subway still carries nearly 2 billion riders a year, making it one of the busiest transit systems on Earth. It operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It is the lifeblood of the city. And it was built on the backs of men who had no safety nets, no protections, no recognition. As you ride the subway today, look around. See the tunnels, the stations, the infrastructure that we all take for granted. And ask yourself, what do you see when you stand on a subway platform? Do you see concrete and steel? Or do you see the ghosts of the sandhogs, the men who were buried alive so that New York could rise? Share your thoughts below.